I died before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't from the searing, breath-stealing pain of the blade, nor was it from the paralyzing fear of the end. It was the absolute, crushing weight of humiliation. The last thing my eyes registered in that miserable life was his expression. Kaelen Thorne, the Crown Prince of Ethelgard. His face was a mask of cold, distant indifference, almost bored, like a scholar idly watching an insect twitch after pinning it to a velvet board. There was no burning anger in his gaze, no soft pity, not a singular shred of regret, just an endless, freezing void. The man for whom I had ruined my reputation, my family, and my very soul didn't even offer me a second glance, as the executioner's heavy broadsword pierced my chest. The heat of my own blood spread with agonizing slowness through the layers of my robes. It was thick, sticky, and overwhelmingly dark, forever staining the pale, silver-embroidered silk I had spent 3 agonizing hours selecting that morning. How utterly pathetic, cut, I thought, my mind detaching from the failing vessel of my body. I had dressed like a bride for my own slaughter. I had wanted to look dignified, beautiful, and undeniable, when I finally confessed the depths of my poisoned heart to him. I had rehearsed those desperate words for months. I whispered them into the dark of my bedchamber, polishing the jagged edges of my obsession until the confession sounded noble instead of what it truly was, a pathetic plea for a scrap of his attention. In the bitter end, I never got to speak a single syllable. The Imperial Guards had moved the moment I stepped forward, striking me down before my lips could part, simply because Kaelen had already given the silent order. Because in this grand, sweeping narrative of a world, I was nothing more than Julian Ashcroft, the disposable villain. My knees hit the polished marble floor first. The sickening crack of bone against stone echoed through the cavernous, silent hall. It was loud enough to feel like a deliberate mockery of my final moment. Someone in the periphery of the vast throne room gasped, likely a servant or a minor noble, too soft for the brutality of the court, but no one stepped forward. No one ever did for Julian. Above me, the throne room's magnificent vaulted ceiling, painted in gold leaf and lapis lazuli, began to blur into a smeared, sickening halo of light. My vision funneled inward. The edges of the world, darkening rapidly like black ink, dropped into a basin of clear water, and still, Kaelen did not take a single step toward me. He stood immovable beside Elian, the Omega protagonist. The one Kaelen was fundamentally, violently destined to love. The Crown Prince had one large, heavily ringed hand resting lightly on Elian's trembling shoulder. His posture was protective, fiercely gentle, and flawlessly picture-perfect. It was exactly as the original novel had described. It was the precise, agonizing scene I had read 100 times in my past life before falling asleep, exactly like the scene where I was meant to die. The irony tasted like copper on my tongue. I had known this would happen. I had memorized every excruciating beat of this tragedy. Yet, when the icy reality of the moment arrived, my dying body still violently trembled. It wasn't from the agonizing trauma of my organs failing, but from a pathetic, childlike hope that maybe, just maybe, reality might diverge from fiction. It didn't. My numb fingers slipped against the flawlessly polished marble, leaving wet, gruesome streaks of crimson that looked entirely too vibrant, almost like wet oil paint. I wondered, with the hazy detachment of the dying, if the head steward would complain about the mess I was leaving behind. Probably. The Imperial Palace of Ethelgard cared infinitely more about pristine appearances than it did about human lives. Remove him. Kaelen's voice washed over me. It was low, calm, and terrifyingly final. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was simply devoid of any interest whatsoever. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second. Perhaps they remembered that I, Julian Ashcroft, had once held immense power, that I had once stood proudly at the right hand of the throne, that I had once been someone they bowed to in the courtyards. But an imperial order was absolute. Rough, calloused hands seized my arms, dragging me upward, lifting me like a discarded, broken marionette, my head lulled weakly to the side. For one last, breathtakingly stupid moment, I searched Kaelen's flawless face through the darkening haze of my vision. I looked for anything, even annoyance. If burning hatred had been etched into his sharp features, I might have felt a twisted sense of relief. Hatred, at the very least, meant that my existence had mattered enough to provoke a genuine emotion. But this absolute nothingness was worse than any physical torture. To Kaelen Thorne, I had never truly existed at all. Then the absolute darkness swallowed the throne room, the pain, and my consciousness. When I snapped my eyes open again, I was 13 years old. At first, I lay completely paralyzed, convinced that death was simply a trick of the mind, that it had stripped away my recent memories, leaving only fragmented, sensory echoes of a terrible nightmare. But the heavy canopy suspended above my bed was undeniably unfamiliar. It was woven from pale, shimmering silk, heavily embroidered with soaring silver cranes. Mid-morning sunlight filtered softly through the sheer gauze curtains, casting warm, golden geometric patterns across my unblemished skin. I inhaled sharply. The air smelled of aged sandalwood, rich calligraphy ink, and fresh parchment. It did not smell of hot blood, it did not smell of cold iron, it did not carry the suffocating, metallic stench of violent death. My chest rose and fell with terrifying ease. There was no agonizing, stabbing pain between my ribs, no wet, suffocating gurgle in my throat, no heavy, leaden weakness dragging my soul down into the abyss. I was alive. The realization should have brought an overwhelming tidal wave of relief. Instead, a cold, venomous dread began to coil slowly in the pit of my stomach. I recognized this lavish bedchamber. I didn't know it from personal, lived experience, but from the vivid illustrations and exhaustive descriptions repeated across dozens of chapters in a book I had once read obsessively in a different lifetime. It was a notoriously angsty, historical Omegaverse novel centered on cutthroat court politics, doomed, star-crossed love, and a tragic villain whose toxic jealousy ultimately destroyed him. The villain who died pathetically in the throne room. The villain who loved the male lead with a sickening desperation. The villain who lost absolutely everything. Me, Julian Ashcroft. I bolted upright so violently that the entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. A wave of intense nausea surged up my throat as decades of unfamiliar, implanted memories flooded my brain all at once. Brutal etiquette lessons. Endless poetry recitations. The razor-sharp, cold smiles of ambitious relatives. The venomous whispers exchanged behind raised silk sleeves. It was a lifetime that fundamentally wasn't mine, yet it fit perfectly into the architecture of my mind, slotting into place like jagged pieces of a puzzle I desperately did not want to complete. My name, my noble status, my cutthroat family, all of it matched the novel with sickening precision. I staggered out of the massive bed, my legs trembling violently like a newborn fawn's. I crossed the sprawling room, gripping the edges of heavy mahogany furniture for support, until I reached the tall, polished bronze mirror in the corner. A young boy stared back at me. His delicate, aristocratic features had not yet sharpened into the striking, lethal beauty of his adulthood. His long, raven-dark hair was tied loosely at the nape of his pale neck. His eyes were too clear, too innocent, too vibrantly alive. I ripped open the front of my nightclothes. My chest was smooth and flawless. There was no jagged, gruesome scar where the executioner's blade had entered. There was no lingering shadow of death clinging to my skin. I was 13 years old. It was exactly 5 years before the main plot of the story truly began. 5 years before Julian would ever officially meet him. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. No, I whispered to the empty room, my voice thin, reedy, and entirely unfamiliar. No, 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 no. This wasn't a merciful second chance. It was a ticking clock, a death sentence wrapped in silk. In the novel, my character, the tragic second male-led and ultimate antagonist, had been introduced as brilliant, breathtakingly elegant, and fiercely loyal to the Ethelgard Empire. He was a high-ranking noble heir endowed with an ethereal beauty and political talent completely unmatched by his peers. He was someone fiercely admired, deeply envied, and universally respected. He was also someone destined to fall spectacularly, violently from grace. Why? Because Julian fell in love with Crown Prince Kaelen Thorne, obsessively, pathetically, self-destructively. When Elian, the gentle, pure, radiant Omega protagonist finally appeared at court, embodying everything Julian fundamentally wasn't, Julian's unrequited love curdled into a toxic, ugly jealousy. He sabotaged Elian. He manipulated the court. He even endangered innocent lives, all in a desperate, screaming attempt to win a fraction of the affection that had never ever been his to claim. The readers of the novel had despised Julian. I had hated him too. That is, until I read the execution scene, until I looked closely and noticed how profoundly alone Julian had been in every single frame of the story, even when he was surrounded by sycophantic crowds, until the sickening realization hit me that no one in his entire life had ever truly loved him back. Not his ambitious family, who viewed him as a political tool, not his shallow friends, not the man he adored to the point of madness. Especially not him. A soft, hesitant knock sounded at the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber. "Young Master Julian, are you awake?" My throat immediately tightened, closing up. The maid's voice filtering through the wood was gentle, overly careful. It was the specific, calculated tone servants reserved for someone who was fiercely important, yet dangerously fragile. I clamped my mouth shut. I didn't answer. I knew with absolute certainty that if I opened my mouth to speak, I might start screaming. And if I started screaming, I might never be able to stop. The brass handle turned with agonizing slowness. The heavy door cracked open just enough for the maid to peek inside. A visible wave of relief softened her tense features when she saw me standing upright by the mirror. "Oh, thank the heavens," she exhaled, stepping inside with a silver tray. "You frightened the entire household yesterday when you collapsed during your history lessons." Collapsed. Right. My mind raced, categorizing the timeline. In this specific timeline, the original Julian had suffered a sudden, severe fever at age 13. It was a minor, almost throwaway incident mentioned only once in the novel's prologue. A convenient literary excuse for why the young lord's personality seemed notably sharper, colder, and more withdrawn afterward, because after this exact fever, I would be the one piloting this doomed body. "I'm fine," I said. I was entirely surprised by how steady, how freezing cold my own voice sounded. She approached cautiously, holding out the silver tray bearing a steaming bowl of dark herbal medicine. She bowed slightly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "The royal physician explicitly said you must rest, young master. Your constitution has always been so delicate. Another defining trait ripped straight from the novel's character sheets. Beautiful, but physically weak. Unearthly graceful, but entirely unsuited for the brutal physical hardships of a knight. He possessed a purely decorative air, rather than the fierce presence of a warrior. He was a beautiful sacrifice waiting to happen. I accepted the ceramic bowl automatically, my hands moving on muscle memory I didn't know I had. I lifted it to my lips. The scalding, violently bitter liquid burned a trail down my throat, grounding me instantly in this visceral, unpleasant reality. This was not a fever dream. It was not a hallucination born of dying synapses. Reincarnation, transmigration, whatever theoretical name scholars might give it, the terrifying result was exactly the same. I was hopelessly trapped inside a narrative whose ending I already knew intimately, and that ending was my brutal, unmourned death. Avoid him. The thought struck me with sudden, crystalline, desperate clarity. If the original Julian's violent downfall began the moment he fell in love with the Crown Prince, then the solution to surviving this hell was blindingly obvious. Never fall in love. Never get close. Never even become a relevant variable in Kaelen Thorne's orbit. In the original lore, the Ashcroft and Thorne families had been steadfast political allies for generations. That meant frequent, unavoidable meetings, shared banquets, inevitable, forced interactions at the palace. In the book, Julian's childhood admiration had slowly grown into friendship, that friendship had festered into infatuation, and that infatuation had mutated into a fatal obsession. It was a slow, beautiful poison expertly disguised as devotion. But what if I simply refused to drink it? What if I actively chose to stay distant, impeccably polite, and utterly forgettable? Kaelen was the male lead. He wouldn't notice a background character who never approached him, who never sought his praise, who never stepped into his light. Without my toxic interference, the Crown Prince would seamlessly follow the original plot of the novel. He would meet the gentle Omega Elian, fall madly in love, ascend the Golden Throne, and live happily ever after. And I would live too, somewhere far, far away from the blood-soaked capital. I would be breathing, entirely anonymous and completely free. For the absolute first time since waking up in this cursed body, a genuine spark of hope flickered in my chest. It was a small, terribly fragile flame, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. The very first time I saw Kaelen Thorne again, that fragile flame of hope didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. It happened precisely at the Imperial Spring Banquet, exactly 2 years later. I was 15 now. This banquet was an event the novel had described in agonizing, loving detail because it marked the pivotal moment. The radiant Omega protagonist Elian's grand debut into high society. I had desperately considered feigning a severe illness to avoid attending. Truly, I had weighed the pros and cons for days. But my sudden absence at such a crucial political event would draw my father's ire and the court's attention, and in this world, attention was inherently dangerous. So I went. I buried my fraying nerves beneath 3 layers of heavy midnight blue silk and a mask of meticulously practiced, icy composure. The imperial gardens were breathtaking. Ethereal string music drifted through the crisp evening air, soft and elegantly melancholic. Thousands of floating paper lanterns glowed among the blossoming plum trees, painting the entire courtyard in shifting, warm hues of gold and rose. High-ranking nobles laughed softly from behind painted silk fans, exchanging political gossip that was sharper and more lethal than any physical blade. And standing at the absolute center of it all, commanding the gravity of the room without even trying, was Crown Prince Kaelen. He was incredibly tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in the royal crimson and black of the Thorne family. He radiated a crushing, suffocating authority even while simply smiling politely at some ancient, trembling minister. He was exactly as the author had described him, exactly as my dying memories recalled. My stomach dropped so violently, it felt as if I had been pushed from a great height. He looked slightly older, sharper than in my traumatic memory of the execution, or perhaps he was simply more alive. The version of Kaelen permanently burned into my retinas had been a man carved from solid glacial ice, emotionless, remote, and devastatingly blank. This version of the Crown Prince moved with an effortless, lethal grace. He acknowledged greetings with slight nods, offered perfectly measured responses, and calculated every single microscopic gesture. He was a ruthless ruler in the making. He was a monster in waiting. Don't look at him. I snapped my gaze downward immediately, turning my body slightly away, as if intently searching the crowd for a lost acquaintance. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs that I was dead certain the surrounding guests could hear the frantic rhythm. Leave. Just fade into the background and leave. But before I could carefully retreat toward the garden's perimeter, a sudden, palpable hush rippled through the sprawling crowd. It was as if the air had been sucked from the courtyard. Palace servants hurriedly parted the gathering, creating a wide, unobstructed path toward the grand entrance. Elian Vane, the Omega protagonist, had arrived. Soft, reverent murmurs immediately chased his footsteps. You could hear the naked admiration, the insatiable curiosity, the burning envy. Even without looking directly at the entrance, I could physically sense the dramatic shift in the atmosphere. It was the undeniable way the court's attention converged upon Elian, pulling toward him like gravity yielding to a collapsing star. In the novel, this exact second was the inciting incident. It was love at first sight. The Crown Prince was supposed to approach the timid Omega, offer a large, scarred hand, and speak gently. Their immediate electric connection would spark instantly, setting the entire romantic, tragic plot into unstoppable motion. I took a slow, calculated step backward, desperately determined to disappear into the plum trees before I became collateral damage in their grand romance. And then I felt the pressure. It wasn't a physical touch. It was something infinitely heavier, like being physically pinned to the earth beneath an unseen, crushing weight. My breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, fighting against every single screaming survival instinct in my brain, I raised my head. I looked up. Crown Prince Kaelen was staring directly at me. Not past me at the arriving Omega. Not through the crowd of nobles. At me, our eyes locked across the lantern-lit expanse of the garden. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, the entire world fell completely silent. The music, the murmurs, the rustling leaves, all of it vanished. A flash of dark recognition surged through his sharp crimson eyes. It was intense, piercing, and gone so rapidly I might have hallucinated it. His polite, diplomatic smile instantly dissolved, replaced by a blank, unreadable expression that made a thick sheen of cold sweat prickle along my spine. This wasn't how the story was supposed to happen. He was supposed to be looking at Elian. He was supposed to be utterly captivated, blindsided by the Omega's pure beauty. So why, Your Highness? Are you looking at the villain, Your Highness? An attendant's nervous voice finally broke the suffocating silence. Kaelen blinked once. His flawless composure snapped back into place, like a porcelain mask sliding over his features. He smoothly turned his broad back to me, stepping gracefully forward to greet the newly arrived Elian with absolute, flawless courtesy. It played out exactly like the original story, exactly like my past life, as if those agonizing, frozen seconds of eye contact between us had never even existed. My knees felt terrifyingly weak. I gripped the edge of a stone balustrade to keep from collapsing. I frantically told myself it was just a coincidence. that the prince had simply been scanning the crowd for threats and happened to pause on my face, that my own crippling paranoia was forcing me to imagine narrative significance where there was absolutely none. Yes, that had to be the truth. Because the alternative, that Kaelen Thorne had noticed Julian Ashcroft before he was supposed to, was a catastrophic impossibility. That night, the moment I returned to the Ashcroft estate, I ordered the servants to cover every single mirror in my chambers with heavy black velvet. I couldn't bear to see the face of the man who was destined to die. I slept horribly. Feverish dreams dragged my consciousness back to the imperial throne room again and again. I heard the sickening echo of armored footsteps on marble. I smelled the copper tang of my own blood. I heard the pathetic, wet sound of my own breathing turning shallow as my lungs filled with fluid. Each time I jolted awake, gasping for air, clutching at my silk nightshirt, as if expecting to find a gaping, fatal wound. Each time there was nothing. Only smooth skin, only a racing, terrified heart. Near dawn, sheer physical exhaustion finally dragged me down into a shallow, restless sleep, and into a vastly different dream. This one didn't feature the throne room. There were no guards. There was no Omega protagonist. It was just a narrow, endlessly long corridor illuminated by a single flickering paper lantern. Heavy footsteps echoed behind me on the wooden floorboards. They were slow, unhurried, entirely impossible to outrun. I tried to walk faster, my breath catching in my throat, and then I tried to run. But the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark, the carved wooden doors passing in a meaningless blur of shadow. The footsteps behind me never once changed their terrifying, rhythmic pace. They were calm and fluid, moving in a slowly action style, natural, soft, and unhurried. Yet they devoured the distance between us with predatory ease. Closer, closer, closer. A large, freezing hand suddenly closed around my wrist. The grip was firm, unyielding, and completely inescapable. Found you. I woke with a strangled, pathetic cry, sitting upright so abruptly that the heavy bed canopy swayed violently above me. My wrist throbbed with a terrifying heat for one agonizing second. I fully expected to look down and see long, pale, elegant fingers wrapped around my skin. Fingers that were merciless. There was nothing. Just cold moonlight spilling across my tangled, sweat-soaked sheets. It was a dream. Only a dream. Yet the phantom sensation lingered intensely. A heavy pressure burning against my skin, as if someone had truly, physically held me there in the dark. I pressed my trembling hand hard against my chest, desperately trying to steady my violently racing heart. "It's not real," I whispered to the empty velvet-draped room. "It's not real," but the words sounded hollow and pathetic in the dead silence. Because deep down in my marrow, I knew that the narrative had already fractured. In the original story, the Crown Prince never spared a single glance for Julian until years later, when Julian's toxic jealousy became a political problem. Kaelen certainly never noticed him at a distance, across a crowded banquet hall, not with that look. Which meant one of two terrifying things. Either the pre-written fate of this world had begun to organically unravel due to the butterfly effect of my apathy, or I had unfortunately stepped into a twisted version of the story where the monster was already wide awake, and somehow, with a sickening sense of dread, I had the terrible, sinking feeling that Kaelen Thorne had been watching me for a very, very long time before I ever looked up. In the agonizing weeks following the spring banquet, I desperately tried to convince myself that nothing fundamental had shifted. I repeated the lie like a mantra. The look we shared meant absolutely nothing. I am not a significant enough variable to disrupt the grand plot. Fate will aggressively correct any minor deviations on its own. People only see what they expect to see, I reasoned. Human memory heavily edits reality until it fits a comfortable narrative. Yes, it was just my own paranoia. I repeated those exact thoughts every morning while my attendants dressed me, and every evening before I blew out the candles to sleep. And every single time, a creeping, cold unease slithered up my spine like icy fingers. The mantra didn't work, because reality had changed. At first, the deviations were minuscule, small things, invitations. The Ashcroft household suddenly began receiving an unprecedented, suspicious number of palace summons. Luncheons with the royal scholars, obscure poetry gatherings in the inner gardens, ceremonial rehearsals for festivals that were months away, events with absolutely no clear political or social purpose. My father, Duke Ashcroft, was practically glowing with pride. In his eyes, increased political visibility with the royal family was always deeply advantageous. The estate servants bustled with manic excitement, polishing heirloom jade ornaments and obsessively airing out my most extravagant formal robes. I, however, was drowning in dread. In the novel, my character had, indeed, attended many high-profile court functions, but those invitations only came years later, after Julian's reputation for tactical brilliance had organically attracted the Emperor's attention. At this current point in the timeline, Julian was considered a moderately promising yet frail youth. He was not yet indispensable. So why the sudden, overwhelming influx of invitations? "Your presence is specifically requested, young master," the head steward informed me one brisk morning, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched his knees. "By the direct order of His Highness, the Crown Prince." My pulse stuttered, misfiring painfully. "Specifically, mine? Yes, young master." He requested Lord Julian Ashcroft by name. The opulent drawing room suddenly felt the size of a closet. The walls were closing in. Refusing a direct, personalized request from the Crown Prince was tantamount to political suicide. The Ashcroft family's loyalty would be immediately questioned. Our numerous political enemies would violently seize the opportunity to accuse us of high arrogance or treasonous disobedience. Even feigning a severe illness would only delay the inevitable, and likely invite royal physicians to my bedside. There was no choice. For Julian, there had never been a choice. The imperial palace felt distinctly different that day than the blood-soaked tomb I remembered from my execution. It was vibrant, overwhelmingly bright, and fiercely alive. Blinding sunlight glittered across the emerald-tiled roofs and the crimson-painted corridors, turning the architecture into something almost painfully beautiful. Dozens of servants moved with silent, terrified efficiency, dropping into deep bows as nobles passed. The air was thick with the scent of blooming plum blossoms drifting from the inner gardens. It was a place meticulously designed for celebration, not death. Yet the paralyzing unease clung to my skin like a damp, suffocating cloth. I kept my gaze firmly glued to the floor as a eunuch escorted me through a dizzying series of open courtyards. I focused entirely on the rhythmic, soft padding of my own steps, the heavy drag of the embroidered silk against my ankles, and the frantic, erratic beating of my heart. "Do not draw attention. Do not look around. Do not raise your head, Lord Julian." The voice came from directly ahead. It was low, liquid, calm, and entirely impossible to disobey. I froze mid-step. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching a sleeping apex predator, I lifted my eyes. Kaelen stood only 3 paces away in the center of the sunlit corridor. There was no massive entourage announcing his arrival. There was no formal, 20-pace distance maintained by the royal guard. It was just the Crown Prince himself, regarding me with a facial expression so deeply composed it might have been chiseled from white jade. Up close, without the barrier of a banquet hall, he was infinitely more overwhelming than my fractured memories allowed. His sheer height, his broad, imposing posture, the sheer weight of his presence, everything about Kaelen demanded absolute, total submission. Even the air around him seemed to warp and bend, as if reality itself recognized its rightful ruler. I dropped into a deep, desperate bow instantly, the blood roaring so loudly in my ears I could barely hear myself think. "This loyal subject greets your highness. May the Empire's sun shine eternal upon you." A suffocating silence followed. It stretched for too long. Palace protocol strictly dictated that a royal should acknowledge a noble's greeting immediately, perhaps offering a polite, generic phrase before continuing on their way. Instead, Kaelen simply stood there and watched me. I could feel it, the crushing weight of his crimson gaze slowly, deliberately tracing every single detail of my form. From the silver crown binding my hair, down the curve of my neck, to the tips of my pale fingers folded neatly before me. He was assessing, measuring, memorizing, stand. My weak knees nearly buckled as I forced myself to straighten up. When I dared to look at his face again, I realized he was closer. Had he stepped forward? I hadn't heard the shift of fabric. I hadn't heard a single footfall over the deafening thunder of my own panic. "You seem fully recovered," Kaelen observed. His tone was casual, conversational, almost shockingly gentle. It was the intimate tone one might use with a cherished younger sibling or a delicate lover, not with the son of a political ally. "Yes, Your Highness, I thank you for your concern. It was only a minor illness," I lied smoothly. A heavy pause hung in the air. "Then you deliberately avoided me at the spring banquet." My breath caught painfully in my throat. It wasn't framed as a question. It was a cold, absolute statement of fact. I I would never presume to intrude upon your highness's valuable attention. I replied carefully, choosing each syllable as if tiptoeing barefoot across a frozen lake. There were many deeply distinguished guests present that evening who required your grace. Another silence, longer, heavier this time. Something dark and unnamed flickered deep within his eyes. A flash of dark amusement, perhaps? Or a flicker of possessive irritation. It vanished behind his jade mask before I could properly categorize it. Distinguished ta, Kaelen repeated softly, rolling the word around on his tongue as if tasting a bitter wine. For a terrifying moment, I truly thought he might step closer, that he might ask something incredibly dangerous, that he might demand an honesty I simply could not afford to give him and live. Instead, he smoothly stepped aside, clearing the path. You may proceed to the pavilion. Julian, dismissed. The wave of relief hit me so forcefully that my vision swam with black spots. I bowed again, deeper and more subservient this time, and then quickly walked past him. I forced my steps to remain measured and composed, violently resisting the animalistic urge to break into a dead sprint. Only when I had navigated several sharp turns of the labyrinthine corridor, putting solid walls between us, did I allow myself to lean against a pillar and truly breathe. My hands were shaking so violently I had to hide them in my wide sleeves. That brief, terrifying encounter should have been the end of it. A minor, unsettling deviation, nothing more. But the relentless palace summons continued, and with them, the suffocating, paralyzing feeling of being constantly observed intensified. It was never overt. No guards aggressively followed me. Conversations in the tea rooms flowed normally, the polite laughter of the nobles rising and falling like gentle waves. Yet, every single time I entered a new room, the ambient energy shifted. Whispers paused a fraction of a second too long. Eyes flicked toward me with calculated interest, then darted away. Palace servants appeared precisely when I needed a drink or a chair, as if they were anticipating my exact physical needs before my brain even registered them. Once, while quietly reading a scroll in a secluded, wisteria-draped pavilion, the hairs on my arms stood on end. I looked up violently, absolutely convinced a shadow was standing behind the painted lattice screen. No one was there. Another time, during a tedious musical performance in the main hall, the prickling sensation on the back of my neck became so agonizingly sharp that my fingers spasmed, and I nearly dropped my porcelain teacup. I scanned the elevated, shadowed royal balcony above. Empty. Except for the slow, rhythmic drifting of the crimson curtains. Empty. It was always empty. It would have been incredibly easy to dismiss it all as lingering trauma from my past life, if not for one terrifying, recurring detail. Whenever that paralyzing sensation peaked, that suffocating, undeniable certainty of being watched by a predator, I would eventually catch a fleeting glimpse of the Crown Prince somewhere nearby. He would be standing across a crowded hall, at the far end of a garden path, standing in the deep, cool shadow beneath a stone colonnade. He never approached me. He never spoke a word. He was just present, existing in my periphery, as if mere coincidence had suddenly grown sharp, blood-stained teeth. "Young master, you seem terribly pale lately," my lead attendant, a kind woman named Sarah, voiced her concern one evening as she brushed my hair. "I'm fine, Sarah. Are you sleeping poorly? The dark circles under your eyes are becoming difficult to conceal with powder." There was no point in lying to her. "Bad dreams." She hesitated, the brush pausing in my dark hair. "Shall I ask the estate physician to brew you some calming lotus herbs?" No, the refusal came out too quick, too razor-sharp. I forced myself to soften my tone. "It isn't necessary, Sarah, really. What could medicinal herbs possibly soothe?" My fear was rooted in the absolute concrete knowledge of a violent future that no one else in this timeline remembered. After she bowed and left, I sat alone in the dead silence of my bedchamber, staring blankly at the velvet-covered mirrors. I had not removed the heavy black cloth since the night of the banquet. Staring at my own reflection felt intrinsically dangerous, as if acknowledging my physical existence in this doomed body too fully might lock my soul permanently into the role of the tragic villain. As long as the mirrors remained shrouded, I could pretend this was all temporary, a strange twisted purgatory before I truly woke up. But weeks bled into months. No awakening came, only more relentless palace summons, more silent, suffocating encounters, and more invisible, burning eyes tracking my every move. The true, horrifying turning point arrived during the annual Imperial Autumn Hunt. In the novel, this massive event served as the definitive romantic bonding moment between Crown Prince Kaelen and the Omega protagonist, Elian. It featured a highly dramatic rescue from a panicked runaway horse, tearful, heartfelt gratitude from the Omega, and searing romantic tension that left readers screaming for more. I had desperately hoped my minor presence in the hunting party would be entirely unnecessary and overlooked. I was dead wrong. Our massive hunting party rode deep into the ancient imperial forest. Gold and crimson banners snapped fiercely in the crisp, biting autumn air. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of towering, ancient pines, painting the damp earth in shifting, chaotic patterns of gold and deep shadow. Flocks of birds scattered violently at the thunderous approach of our horses, their sharp cries echoing through the woods like desperate warnings. I purposely kept my mare to the absolute rear of the formation, surrounded by a buffer of minor, chatty nobles. I focused entirely on staying utterly unnoticed. Then, exactly on cue, chaos erupted. A sharp shout pierced the air. A horse reared violently onto its hind legs. Elian, the delicate Omega protagonist, lost his grip on the reins as his magnificent white mount bolted sideways in sheer terror. Elian's eyes were wide, wild with blind panic. It was playing out exactly like the novel. Panic rippled like a shockwave through the aristocratic group. Noble riders struggled frantically to maneuver their own agitated mounts without causing a deadly pileup. Elian clung desperately to the horse's mane, his beautiful face completely drained of color, screaming for help. In the original sacred text of the story, this was the exact moment where the Crown Prince spurred his massive black stallion forward, effortlessly catching the runaway horse and pulling the weeping Omega to safety against his broad chest. It was heroic, decisive, intoxicatingly romantic. I sat back in my saddle and watched, holding my breath, waiting for the pivotal narrative moment to unfold. It didn't, because before Kaelen even twitched the reins of his horse, my own mare screamed in sudden, blinding agony. Something heavy and lethal struck its flank. An arrow, my panicked brain realized dimly. The injured animal lurched violently, bucking with terrifying force and throwing me entirely off balance. I was launched into the air. Blinding, white-hot pain exploded through my left shoulder as I hit the unforgiving, hard-packed earth. The brutal impact drove every ounce of air from my lungs. For a few agonizing seconds, I lay paralyzed, staring up at the canopy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The world spun in a sickening, chaotic blur of trampling hooves, shouting nobles, and swirling dust. Then, incredibly strong, unyielding arms slipped beneath me, lifting my broken body upright and pulling me flush against a wall of solid muscle. The intoxicating, overpowering scent of cold cedar and sharp steel filled my deprived lungs. It was clean, dominating, utterly unmistakable. "I have you." His voice vibrated close to my ear. Too close. I froze, the pain in my shoulder eclipsed by sheer terror. Of all the infinite branching outcomes I had mapped out in my mind for this day, this was definitively not one of them. "Your Highness," I gasped, trying to pull away. "Do not move." The command was absolute, leaving zero room for argument. One of his massive arms remained locked firmly around my waist, holding my trembling body steady against his chest as if I weighed absolutely nothing. I became hyper-aware of every single point of physical contact between us, the searing heat radiating through our layers of heavy hunting fabric, the terrifying strength lurking just beneath his controlled restraint. Meanwhile, through the ringing in my ears, I heard several royal guards finally secure Elian's panicked horse. They surrounded the Omega protagonist, who appeared deeply shaken, weeping softly, but entirely physically unharmed. So, the grand rescue still happened. The plot point survived, just not executed by the male lead, not directly. "Is Julian injured?" Kaelen asked. His voice was freezing cold, and he did not look away from me for a single second to check on his supposed fated love, Elian. A royal physician, breathless and pale, scrambled to my side and performed a rapid, frantic examination of my shoulder. A minor dislocation, it seems, Your Highness," the old man stammered, sweating profusely under the prince's deadly glare. "Extremely painful, certainly, but not life-threatening. The arrow merely grazed the mount. Good. That single, heavy word carried a quiet, terrifying finality. It was spoken as if a more serious injury to me would have been completely unacceptable to the very fabric of reality itself. Only then did Kaelen finally release his iron grip on me. He did so slowly, with obvious, agonizing reluctance. His long, calloused fingers lingered on my uninjured arm a fraction of a second too long before finally withdrawing. The sudden cold absence of his physical contact felt almost like a profound loss. I hated myself for feeling that. Later, as the panicked attendants fussed over my freshly bandaged shoulder in a secluded royal tent, I replayed the chaotic incident in my mind, again and again, like a macabre theater production. The arrow had come from deep within the forest, striking from behind. A stray shot from a poacher, the captain of the guard, had confidently declared to the furious nobles, an incredibly unfortunate accident during the confusion of the runaway horse. But I had intentionally ridden at the absolute rear of the massive formation. No one, not a poacher, not a noble, should have been aiming or shooting in that specific direction. More importantly, Kaelen had reached my fallen body almost instantly. He was there faster than the closest guards. Faster than seemed physically possible, given the vast distance that had separated us in the formation just moments earlier. It was as if he hadn't been watching Elian at all. It was as if he had been watching me, as if he had been anticipating the fall, waiting for the exact moment to catch me. That night, back at the Ashcroft estate, sleep did not come at all. Silver moonlight crept slowly across the floorboards of my room, pale and entirely unforgiving. Outside the window, a bitter autumn wind stirred the ancient trees, their bare branches scratching softly against the stone walls like the restless fingers of the dead. I lay completely motionless, staring up into the suffocating darkness, my dislocated shoulder throbbing in perfect time with my racing pulse. Every single logical, rational explanation I tried to construct in my mind collapsed under its own flimsy weight. Coincidence did not relentlessly track a single minor character across multiple unrelated events. Coincidence did not aggressively alter the sequence of major canonical plot points. Coincidence did not feel like hot breath grazing the back of your neck when you were standing in an empty room. A terrible, earth-shattering possibility surfaced from the depths of my mind. What if the story wasn't changing randomly due to a butterfly effect? What if the story was changing specifically because of me, because I had consciously stepped out of the original script, and someone, some powerful, unstoppable force, outright refused to let me leave the stage? My throat tightened, choking on the thought. No, impossible. In the novel, Crown Prince Kaelen Thorne barely acknowledged the villain's existence until the very end. His entire emotional focus, his obsession, was explicitly dedicated to the Omega protagonist. Intricate political warfare, slow-burn romantic development, external military threats, those were the massive engines that drove the plot, not some obscure, sickly noble desperately trying to hide in the background. Unless the version of Kaelen in this specific world had never actually been following the author's script to begin with. Unless the profound, fated love for the Omega described in the book had been grossly exaggerated. Or worse, a carefully manufactured performance. The thought chilled me far more deeply than any nightmare of the executioner's blade. Because if his legendary love for Elian was a complete fabrication, an illusion, then where had all of Kaelen's terrifying, obsessive attention gone instead? A faint, nearly imperceptible sound broke the silence of my bedchamber. It wasn't the wind outside, it was inside, the soft, deliberate click of the brass handle turning, the heavy wooden door opening. I bolted upright in bed, my heart slamming against my ribs so violently I thought it might crack my sternum. "Who's there?" No answer. The expansive room remained, pitch dark, the shadows pooling in the corners like thick, spilled ink. The silk curtains surrounding the bed stirred slightly, though I felt no breeze touch my clammy face. Perhaps it was Sarah, coming to check on my shoulder. Perhaps heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, confident. Approaching the edge of the bed, they moved with that same slowly action, fluidity from my nightmare. Natural, soft, and unhurried. Every survival instinct honed across 2 lifetimes screamed at me to run, to scream for the guards, to fight. But my body completely betrayed me, refusing to move. I was trapped in a paralyzed state between absolute terror and frantic disbelief. The moonlight shifted as a tall figure deliberately stepped into its pale path, illuminating the outline of impossibly broad shoulders, long dark hair, and royal robes that were darker than the surrounding night. My mouth went bone dry. There were no royal guards, no eunuchs announcing his arrival, no fanfare, only him. Crown Prince Kaelen Thorne stopped exactly 3 paces away from the edge of my bed. His crimson gaze was fixed directly on me with an intensity so unsettling it felt like a physical violation. "You're awake." It wasn't a question of surprise. It was a cold observation confirmed. "What are you doing here?" The words tore out of my throat, hoarse and trembling, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then he spoke quietly, making sure you're alive. My blood instantly turned to glacial ice. Before my paralyzed brain could even formulate a response to that terrifying statement, Kaelen smoothly stepped back, already retreating into the shadows toward the door. His movement was so incredibly fluid, so perfectly controlled it almost seemed supernatural, like a dark specter sliding across a stone wall. The heavy door closed with a soft click, making absolutely no sound, leaving me completely alone. Or, at least, appearing to be alone. I did not sleep for a single second the rest of the night. By the time the golden dawn broke, one horrifying truth had become absolutely impossible to ignore. The tragic story I remembered, the one where I was a pathetic, irrelevant background piece until my own toxic jealousy destroyed me, no longer applied to this reality, because the monster of the story was paying full attention to me now, and attention from a predator like Kaelen Thorne was not a blessing. It was a brand. It was a claim of ownership. Somewhere deep in the center of my chest, that tiny fragile flame of hope I had harbored for 2 years finally sputtered and died. I had desperately wanted to survive by simply staying out of the narrative, but survival was impossible when the protagonist possessed the script, burned it, and outright refused to let you leave his sight. And the most terrifying part of all? I was beginning to suspect that the Crown Prince had never, not for a single second, been interested in the Omega at all. After the night the prince inexplicably entered my private chamber, true sleep became a myth. It wasn't just that specific night. Every single night that followed, I began to dread the setting sun in a visceral way that had absolutely nothing to do with childish fears of the dark. To me, darkness meant blindness. It meant that something incredibly powerful and lethal could be standing just inches beyond my reach in the shadows, watching me breathe, waiting for me to break, deciding my fate while I lay oblivious. I became paranoid. I ordered Sarah and the other servants to keep additional oil lamps lit in my quarters until the sun fully crested the horizon. The servants exchanged deeply worried, pitying glances, but they dutifully obeyed. In the capital, rumors in noble households spread faster than wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone in high society knew that Lord Julian Ashcroft suffered from severe, lingering shock and night terrors after the brutal hunting accident. Let them think I'm fragile, I thought bitterly. Let them think I'm descending into madness. Madness is infinitely safer than the truth. Because the truth was horrifyingly simple. The future Emperor of Ethelgard could bypass my family's security, enter my private bedchamber whenever he pleased, without seeking permission, without leaving witnesses, without offering a single explanation. And absolutely no one in the world would be able to stop him. During the sunlit hours, I functioned exactly as expected of a noble heir. I attended boring economic lessons, drafted political correspondence, smiled at ceremonies, and engaged in vapid, polite conversation with visiting lords. I was the picture of aristocratic perfection. At night, I became a hunted animal. I listened. I strained my ears for every microscopic creak of the wooden floorboards, every soft silken whisper of fabric brushing against a doorframe, every sudden brush of wind against the heavy wooden shutters. Sometimes nothing happened at all. I would exhaust myself listening to the silence until I passed out. Sometimes I swore I heard the distinct rhythm of footsteps, only to throw open my door and discover completely empty corridors, making me question my own sanity. And sometimes I stayed perfectly, rigidly still beneath my blankets, aggressively pretending to be deep asleep, because I was absolutely certain that a towering presence stood right near the edge of my bed, breathing quietly, not reaching out to touch me, just existing there, hovering over me like a gargoyle. I never dared to open my eyes during those terrifying moments. Call it sheer cowardice, call it primal instinct. I had a deep, primitive understanding that looking at him, acknowledging his physical presence in my room, would make the twisted situation real in a way my fragile mind simply could not survive. Eventually, after hours of psychological torture, the crushing presence would fade. The air in the room would feel significantly lighter. Dawn would finally arrive, leaving me physically exhausted, mentally frayed, and absolutely no closer to understanding what sick game the prince was playing. Running away stopped being an abstract, comforting fantasy. It mutated into an urgent biological necessity. In the original novel, the villainous Julian had far too many toxic attachments. He was bound by heavy family obligations, burning political ambitions, and a pathetic emotional dependency on the capital's high society. His foolish pride and his rabid obsession with Kaelen chained him to the palace long after it became blatantly clear he was fighting a losing battle. I, however, possessed none of those fatal weaknesses. This world, this body, this status, none of it was truly mine. Yes, Duke Ashcroft and the family whose name I carried had treated me with a generic, distant kindness. The servants genuinely cared for my well-being. High society respected my intellect. But all of this affection was built on the foundation of a stranger's borrowed memories. It felt incredibly fragile and conditional. Like an expensive, beautiful painting hung on someone else's wall. I could admire it, but I couldn't claim it. My survival came first. If staying in the capital meant an inevitable, gruesome death, or worse, whatever twisted, possessive fate Kaelen currently intended for me, then fleeing the empire was the only rational choice left. The monumental challenge was executing the escape without attracting his omniscient suspicion. A high-ranking noble heir cannot simply vanish into the night like a common thief, but he can travel for his health. I wish to visit the family's South Coast estates, I announced, during dinner. My father, Duke Ashcroft, paused, looking up from his stack of taxation documents, his thick brows knitted together in mild surprise. The southern estates? So suddenly, Julian? The royal physicians have strongly recommended warmer, sea air for my lingering health issues, I replied smoothly, meeting his gaze without blinking. The harsh winters in the capital have always been incredibly difficult for my lungs. It wasn't entirely a lie. This borrowed body did tire with frustrating ease, and my recent agonizing sleeplessness had left my complexion pale and sickly enough to make the excuse highly convincing. The Duke studied my face for a long, heavy moment. His gaze was sharp and calculating, despite his outward, fatherly gentleness. You have never shown a singular ounce of interest in estate management or leaving the social season before, Julian. I am growing older, father. I should begin learning how to manage our lands. Another heavy silence stretched across the dining table. Then, he sighed, setting aside his silver cutlery. Very well, your health is paramount. It would likely do you good to spend some quiet time away from the viciousness of court politics right now. The atmosphere at the palace has been tense. Relief crashed over me in a massive wave, nearly making my weak knees give out beneath the table. However, he continued, raising a stern finger, you will travel with a full, heavily armed escort. Bandit activity on the southern roads has increased significantly in recent months. I will not risk my heir, of course. Freedom in this world always came with heavy iron chains attached. Still, geographical distance mattered infinitely more than privacy on the road. Once I was far enough away from the suffocating grip of the capital, and from Kaelen, opportunities would naturally arise. Travel routes could be suddenly altered due to weather. The loyal escorts could be dismissed or diverted under highly plausible, noble pretexts. The coastal ports in the south offered the ultimate prize, anonymity. Massive merchant ships departed daily for distant foreign provinces. Some even sailed far beyond the known borders of the Ethelgard Empire. Once I was on a ship at sea, imperial pursuit would become exponentially, logistically harder. I could start a new life, quiet, hidden, safe. Preparation for the journey took 3 agonizing days. The estate servants bustled around the clock, packing heavy trunks with fine clothing, exotic medicines, writing materials, and the endless small comforts deemed strictly necessary for a delicate noble's journey. Iron-reinforced carriages were meticulously inspected. The fastest horses were selected. Elite guards were briefed on the route. Everything proceeded with the terrifying efficiency of a wealthy household deeply accustomed to grand travel. I moved through the chaos like a silent ghost, hyper-vigilant, terrified of revealing even a fraction of my internal urgency. Inside my head, my thoughts raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. South means a warmer climate. It means significantly fewer direct imperial checkpoints. It means coastal access. On the foggy morning of my departure, a thick, gray mist clung stubbornly to the damp ground like a mourning veil. It softened the sharp edges of the estate buildings and the ancient trees. The heavy wooden wheels of my carriage creaked loudly as it rolled forward, finally leaving the towering iron gates of the Ashcroft estate behind. I did not look back out the window. Looking back felt like extending a dangerous invitation to regret. For the first several hours of the journey, absolutely nothing happened. The muddy dirt road stretched endlessly ahead in gentle, winding curves. It was lined on both sides by towering, dead winter trees whose barren branches intertwined menacingly overhead, looking like skeletal fingers grasping at the gray sky. My armed guards rode in a tight, highly disciplined formation around the carriage. Their stoic presence was actually reassuring in a mundane, practical way. This was normal travel. This was movement. This was the first taste of true freedom. My tight chest gradually began to loosen. The crushing tension slowly drained from muscles I hadn't even realized were permanently clenched. I let out a long, shaky exhale. Perhaps I had vastly overreacted. Perhaps physical distance truly was enough to break his fixation. Kaelen was the Crown Prince, for God's sake. He had an entire empire to run. He had a war council to manage. He had an Omega protagonist to court. He could not possibly abandon the capital just to chase one insignificant, paranoid noble across the countryside. Yes, this plan would work. I allowed myself to sink back into the plush velvet cushions. I closed my heavy eyes, finally lulled by the rhythmic rocking sway of the carriage. Screech! The horses screamed in blind terror. The carriage lurched violently sideways, the massive wheels skidding in the mud. I was thrown hard against the wooden door, my previously injured shoulder taking the brunt of the brutal impact. Frantic shouts erupted from outside. Total confusion. Barked orders, alarm, and then the unmistakable, horrifying swings of steel scraping rapidly against steel. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice cracking in panic as I pushed the carriage door open a fraction to look. A massive, ancient pine tree completely blocked the narrow road ahead. It hadn't fallen naturally. The massive cut at the base of the trunk was far too clean. The placement across the road was too deliberate, too perfect. Bandits. Dozens of them erupted from the dense forest on both sides of the road. Their faces were covered in dirty cloth masks, their rusted weapons drawn. So this was exactly why Father insisted on the elite escorts, Kai realized dimly, my heart hammering in my throat. The Ashcroft guards immediately formed a tight defensive circle around my carriage, their polished blades flashing in the dull morning light as they fiercely engaged the ambushers. The deafening clash of metal rang sharply through the cold air, harsh and utterly chaotic. I shrank back into the deepest, darkest corner of the carriage, pulling my knees to my chest. Stay inside. Stay hidden. Let the trained soldiers handle the slaughter, but as I listened to the battle rage just inches from my thin wooden sanctuary, something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The bandits weren't actually trying to break through the guard line to reach the baggage carts holding the gold. They weren't fighting to kill. They were fighting aggressively, yet strangely defensively, parrying blows and dodging, as if their sole, collective objective was merely to create a massive disruption, rather than to steal or murder. It's a diversion, the cold realization crept into my mind like poison. But a diversion for what? The carriage door on the opposite side, the side facing the dense, unoccupied forest, suddenly clicked open. I turned my head sharply and froze, the breath completely leaving my lungs. Kaelen Thorne stood there. He was perfectly framed by the gray, foggy morning light. He looked utterly, insanely incongruous amidst the violent chaos of a bandit ambush in the mud. He wore no heavy armor. He carried no drawn weapon. He was simply dressed in immaculate, dark traveling robes, as pristine and flawless as if he had just stepped out of an imperial portrait rather than into a bloody melee on a dirt road. For 5 agonizing seconds, my brain completely short-circuited. It actively refused to process the visual information my eyes were sending it. "You will come with me," Kaelen said calmly. He extended a large, gloved hand toward me. It was not a desperate request. It was not a rushed explanation. It was an absolute command, delivered with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a god demanding tribute. "What? What are you doing here?" My voice shook violently, despite my desperate effort to control it. I pressed my back harder against the velvet cushions, trying to meld into the wall. "You should be in the capital," I was, he replied simply, which meant absolutely nothing, and answered absolutely nothing. The sound of steel clashing echoed loudly nearby. One of my guards screamed in agony. The thick, metallic smell of fresh blood drifted through the open carriage door, mixing sickeningly with the cold air. "Your safety on this road is severely compromised, Julian," Kaelen continued. His tone was as flat and composed as if we were sitting in a sunlit parlor discussing the weather. "Step out of the carriage." Every single instinct in my body screamed, "Danger!" and the alarm wasn't blaring because of the masked bandits slaughtering my men. It was blaring because of him. I am perfectly safe with my family's escort, I spat, my voice rising in panic. Leave me alone. Kaelen's eyes darkened instantly. The crimson irises seemed to catch the dull light and bleed. For the absolute first time, a genuine raw emotion violently broke through his flawless jade mask. It wasn't simple anger. It was something far more ancient, more primal, and vastly more terrifying. It was absolute, consuming possession. Do not be difficult, Julian. The words were spoken softly, terrifyingly softly. I'm not going anywhere with you, I yelled, my heart hammering so hard in my chest it physically hurt. A heavy, unnatural silence fell completely between us. It was strange. It was as if the interior of the carriage had been suddenly insulated from the violent battle raging outside. The screams and the clashing steel became muffled background noise to the sheer, oppressive gravity of his presence. Then, Kaelen smoothly stepped up and inside the carriage. He closed the physical distance between us in a single, fluid motion, like a predator striking. There is absolutely no need to fear, he whispered, his massive frame looming over me, trapping me in the corner. I will not harm you. It sounded like a vow. It felt exactly like a death threat. I didn't say I was afraid, I lied, trembling violently. You didn't need to. His large hand shot forward and closed like a vice around my wrist. It wasn't bruisingly painful, but it was unyielding, inevitable. It was the exact horrifying sensation from my recurring nightmare. Pure, unfiltered panic surged through my veins. I twisted wildly, kicking out, using my free hand to try and pry his fingers off my arm, desperately trying to pull free. But his grip only tightened slightly, anchoring my entire body in place as effortlessly as if I were made of brittle parchment. Let go of me, no. That single heavy syllable cut through my frantic protests with chilling finality. Outside the carriage, the chaotic sounds of combat suddenly began to fade, not because the battle was over, but because the source of the noise was growing distant. The carriage was moving. When had it started moving? I hadn't felt the harsh jolt of the driver whipping the horses. I hadn't felt the massive vehicle shift, yet, through the small glass window, I could clearly see the barren winter trees sliding past at a rapid, steady speed. We were moving away from the ambush, away from my guards. We are leaving, Kaelen stated calmly, settling his massive frame onto the bench beside me, pulling me closer so I was practically pressed against his side. Without my guards? I gasped, staring at him in horror. They are no longer necessary for your protection. My stomach plummeted into an endless abyss. What did you do? I ensured your safety. The answer was technically, semantically correct, which somehow made it vastly more frightening than a blatant lie. He had orchestrated the entire attack, the bandits, the fallen tree, the diversion. It was all a theatrical play designed to isolate me. I stopped struggling, not because I had accepted the horrific situation, but because I realized with crushing despair that physical resistance accomplished absolutely nothing against him. His grip on my wrist remained unyielding. He slowly shifted his hand so that his thumb rested lightly directly against the frantic, fluttering point on my inner wrist. He was feeling each terrified beat of my heart, monitoring my fear. The physical contact was not overtly aggressive, yet there was something deeply, psychologically invasive about it. It was a quiet, absolute assertion of total control. Why? I finally asked, my voice broken, barely above a hoarse whisper. He turned his head slowly, regarding me for a very long moment. His expression was completely unreadable. Because you were leaving, he said softly. That's not it normally. A shard of ice slid slowly down my spine. Then why? You did not inform me. The sheer breathtaking absurdity of that statement left me entirely speechless for a moment. I am not required to report my personal movements to the Crown Prince. I finally managed to choke out. A very faint, chilling smile touched the corners of his lips. You are now. There was no arrogance in his tone. There was no raised voice, just absolute, terrifying certainty. As if this ownership over me were a fundamental law of physics that I had somehow foolishly overlooked. I stared at his flawless profile, desperately trying to reconcile this calm, possessive stranger with the distant, cold figure from the novel. The man who was supposedly devoted entirely to Elian. The man who was utterly indifferent to Julian, until Julian's jealousy violently forced a confrontation. Absolutely nothing matched the text. Nothing made logical sense, unless a horrifying, sickening possibility finally surfaced and crystallized in my mind. What, exactly, am I to you? I asked, completely unable to keep the violent tremor from my voice. Kaelen's crimson gaze sharpened instantly. The intensity spiked so abruptly it felt like a physical blow to my chest. Someone who should not try to run away. It wasn't an answer, it was a claim. The carriage rolled on in suffocating silence. I sat paralyzed, watching the gray, bleak landscape blur past the window. A heavy, terrifying numbness began spreading through my limbs as the grim reality of the situation settled over me like heavy iron chains. My escape attempt had failed spectacularly. The geographical distance I sought was meaningless. My family's protection was completely irrelevant, because the mortal danger to my life had never been rogue bandits, or cutthroat court politics, or even the destined plot of the novel. It had always been him. As the purple dusk rapidly approached, the carriage finally slowed. It turned sharply off the main highway onto a narrow, hidden dirt road that wound steeply upward toward a secluded, sprawling estate nestled among the darkening, forested hills. I scanned the architecture frantically, but I did not recognize this location from any description in the novel, which meant one terrifying thing. This place existed entirely outside the story, outside the original script, outside of any future I could have possibly prepared for. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice tight. "My private residence," Kaelen replied smoothly. "I've never heard of it. You were not meant to." The massive iron gate swung open without a single challenge from a guard. Armed sentries in unmarked black armor bowed deeply as our carriage passed through. Paper lanterns flickered to life along the winding cobblestone path, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch toward the carriage like reaching, desperate hands. A gilded cage, I realized with a sickening lurch of my stomach. It was hidden, it was beautiful, and it was entirely inescapable. Like hollowing out a suspended tree trunk, he had built this cage from the inside out, hollowing out my defenses before I even realized I was trapped. The carriage rolled to a smooth stop before the grand main entrance. Kaelen finally released my wrist. The sudden absence of his grip felt strangely abrupt, leaving behind a phantom warmth on my skin that made my flesh crawl with revulsion. "Come," he said. He stepped down effortlessly from the carriage first and turned, offering his large hand to help me down. I stared at his palm. I didn't take it. For a split second, something incredibly dangerous flashed across his handsome face. Extreme irritation, perhaps, or the dark echo of violence barely kept under restraint. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by that same, infuriatingly calm mask, as if he had internally calculated that absolute patience was the better strategy for taming a wild animal. I ignored his hand and climbed down the steps on my own, my legs shaking badly. The heavy carriage doors closed behind us with a solid thud that sounded far too final for my comfort. Inside, the grand estate was unnervingly quiet. There were no bustling, gossiping servants. There was no distant chatter from the kitchens. There were only a few attendants moving silently like ghosts through the wide corridors, lit by soft, golden oil lamps. The air inside smelled faintly, intoxicatingly of cedar and ink, the exact same scent that clung to Kaelen's skin. My stomach violently twisted. "Your room has been prepared," he said, gesturing down a long hallway. "Prepared, not chosen by me. Not offered as a guest." "Prepared, I didn't agree to stay here," I said, digging my heels into the woven rug. "You don't need to agree." A violent chill ran straight down my spine. I looked up into his eyes. "What happens if I aggressively refuse?" Kaelen stopped walking. For a long, agonizing moment, he did not turn around to face me. The silence in the hall was deafening. When he finally pivoted slowly on his heel, his expression was completely composed, almost gentle even, but his eyes were not gentle at all. They were a roaring inferno. "I would highly prefer you not to test that, Julian." It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was far worse. It was an immovable boundary drawn in solid stone. That night, I sat completely rigid on the edge of an unfamiliar massive bed, my hands tightly clenched in the heavy fabric of my silk robes. The bedchamber was absurdly luxurious. It was comfortable, meticulously arranged, possessing everything an honored guest might ever require. Everything except a locking mechanism on the inside of the heavy mahogany door. Silver moonlight spilled across the polished floorboards, pale and unforgiving. I did not even bother lying down. Lying down felt like yielding. Sleep felt like total surrender, and surrender to Kaelen Thorne felt exactly like dying. Somewhere deep within the silent estate, heavy footsteps echoed faintly through the halls. Slow, unhurried, calculating. Moving closer, sitting there in the dark, I finally truly understood a terrifying reality that the original, foolish villain of the novel never had. This was not a tragic romance story where persistence would eventually be rewarded with affection. This was a meticulously crafted trap that had been slowly, silently closing around my throat long before I ever noticed the jaws. And now there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The days that followed my capture settled into a quiet, suffocating routine that felt infinitely more terrifying than any open, violent threat. There were no armed guards violently dragging me back to my room when I obsessively wandered through the estate's sprawling corridors. There were no locked iron doors barring my way to the gardens. The estate servants treated me with a careful, hyper-vigilant politeness. They were neither warm nor cold, acting exactly as if they had been strictly instructed by the Crown Prince to make me completely physically comfortable without ever encouraging human familiarity. Every single physical need I had was miraculously anticipated before I even voiced it. Fresh, perfectly tailored silk clothing in my exact measurements appeared in the heavy wardrobe each morning. Extravagant, multi-course meals arrived in the dining room exactly when a pang of hunger began to stir in my stomach. Even the oil lamps in the library were adjusted to the exact brightness I preferred for reading without my ever having to ask a servant. If this was captivity, it was brilliantly designed by a mastermind who fundamentally understood that physical iron chains were entirely unnecessary if you padded the cage with enough velvet. For the first 4 days, I searched obsessively, constantly, for weaknesses in his perfect system. I casually tested the heavy oak doors that led outside. I mentally noted exactly which reinforced windows on the ground floor opened wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. I sat by the windows for hours, memorizing the patrol rotations of the silent guards. I mapped out the complex layout of the estate grounds from every single angle I could physically access. The private estate was large, but not enormous. It was strategically nestled against a dense, forested hill on the northern side, and bordered by a sheer, deadly cliff drop on the southern side. Only one narrow, winding dirt road connected the property to the main imperial highway, and that road was guarded discreetly but incredibly effectively. Anyone attempting to flee the grounds on foot would be highly visible to the archers long before ever reaching the tree line. Still, I told myself that escape was statistically possible. It had to be. People escaped from heavily fortified prisons every day. Supply carriages arrived loaded with grain and departed empty. Imperial messengers on horseback came and went at all hours. Estate servants occasionally traveled down the mountain to nearby villages to trade. If I could somehow steal a cloak to blend in, or create a massive distraction, perhaps a fire in the stables, I might just be able to slip away unnoticed in the chaos. That single fragile thread of hope sustained my sanity through the agonizing first week. Surprisingly, Kaelen did not aggressively interfere with my movements. The Crown Prince did not confine me to my luxurious room, nor did he demand my constant, forced companionship. In fact, he seemed to only appear in my vicinity when I least expected him, as if guided by some dark supernatural intuition regarding my location. Sometimes he would silently join me for meals without any prior notice. He would sit directly across the long mahogany table, eating in composed, regal silence while I struggled internally, trying to swallow my food and pretend his suffocating presence did not make my hands shake. Other times, I would catch sight of him standing at a distance in the expansive gardens. He would be speaking in low tones with an armored attendant, or reading a scroll beneath the shade of a pavilion roof, his attention ostensibly occupied by imperial matters. Yet, even when he wasn't looking at me, I could not shake the heavy, burning feeling that he remained entirely, biologically aware of my exact coordinates on the property. Since the carriage ride, he had not physically touched me again. Not once. That deliberate physical restraint should have deeply reassured me. It should have made me feel safer. Instead, it achieved the exact opposite effect. It felt incredibly calculated. It felt exactly like a starving hunter choosing not to spring the trap just yet, simply because he knew the terrified prey had absolutely nowhere left to run, and he was thoroughly enjoying the psychological terror of the wait. My golden opportunity for escape came much sooner than I ever expected. Late one afternoon on the 8th day, a massive, violent storm swept aggressively across the hills. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a sudden, blinding silver curtain of water that blurred the entire landscape and drummed deafeningly against the tiled roofs. The sheer ferocity of the storm immediately drove most of the estate servants indoors and forced the perimeter guards to seek desperate shelter beneath the stone gatehouse awnings. Visibility outside dropped to almost absolutely zero beyond a few dozen paces. They were perfect, chaotic conditions for disappearing. I had been obsessively studying the perimeter long enough to know that a narrow, muddy maintenance path ran closely along the inner stone wall, leading toward a small, rusted postern gate used exclusively by delivery workers and stable hands. Normally, that gate remained heavily padlocked and closely watched by a sentry. But during torrential downpours, inspections were notoriously less frequent. If I could just reach the edge of the dense pine forest before anyone realized my room was empty, the chaotic terrain and the driving rain might completely wash away my trail, hiding me long enough to put serious, miles of distance between myself and this gilded nightmare. I did not allow my brain to think logically beyond that exact point. Planning too far ahead into the unknown invited paralyzing fear, and fear in this moment equaled death. I simply acted. I grabbed a heavy, dark woolen servant's cloak I had smuggled from the laundry and threw it over my shoulders, pulling the deep hood low to conceal my face. I slipped out of my chamber and moved rapidly through the dimly lit side corridors. My heart was pounding so aggressively loudly against my ribs that I was terrified the sound would echo against the stone walls and alert the guards. Every single wet footstep I took sounded impossibly loud in my own ears, despite the deafening roar of the thunder outside. I fully expected someone to shout, "Halt!" at any given second. I expected to feel Kaelen's massive hand close violently around my arm and yank me backward into the dark. No one did. The rusted iron postern gate loomed ahead in the gray downpour. The iron hinges were slick with freezing rainwater. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, as I grabbed the handle, I thought it might be locked from the outside. But when I threw my entire body weight against the wood, it yielded. The door opened with a low, agonizing groan that was thankfully swallowed instantly by a massive clap of thunder. Freezing, sharp air rushed in, carrying the intoxicating, earthy scent of wet soil and pine needles. Freedom. I stepped through the threshold into the storm and broke into a dead sprint. I did not look back. The dense forest swallowed me whole almost immediately. The torrential rain cascaded violently through the thick branches in shimmering sheets. It soaked through my heavy wool cloak and my silk clothing within mere minutes, turning the steep dirt ground beneath my boots into treacherous, sliding mud. Thick twigs snapped loudly underfoot despite my desperate efforts to step lightly. The visibility shrank to a terrifyingly narrow tunnel of gray between the massive tree trunks. Still, I kept pushing forward, forcing my burning legs to carry me downhill, violently away from the estate, praying I would stumble upon a faint suggestion of a hunting path that might eventually lead to a village or the main road. My lungs burned like fire from the extreme exertion. My thighs trembled violently from the sheer physical tension, but the massive surge of adrenaline pushed me forward through the pain. If I stop, I will start thinking, I told myself. If I start thinking about what he'll do when he catches me, I will freeze. Minutes stretched into what felt like agonizing hours. The violent storm showed absolutely no sign of easing. The forest grew significantly denser, darker, and more treacherous the farther I traveled. Jagged branches clawed viciously at my face and sleeves. Hidden tree roots caught at the toes of my leather boots. More than once, I stumbled and fell hard into the freezing mud, scraping my palms raw before scrambling back to my feet. Eventually, the faint, distant sounds of the estate faded completely. There were no shouts of alarm, no ringing bells, no sense of human presence or pursuit whatsoever. There was only the roar of the rain, the howling wind, and the relentless, painful pounding of my own heart. I finally slowed my pace, collapsing against the trunk of a massive oak tree. I bent forward, bracing my scraped hands on my trembling knees as I fought desperately to catch my breath. The freezing rain plastered my dark hair to my face. For the absolute first time since fleeing, a fragile, intoxicating spark of triumph flickered brightly through my chest. I had actually done it. I had created enough physical distance that even if his guards noticed my absence right now, physically tracking my footprints through this torrential mudslide would be virtually impossible. I was out of the cage. Maybe I really could vanish. Maybe I could rewrite my own fate. Maybe. A large hand closed gently, firmly around my shoulder. I froze instantly, every single muscle in my exhausted body locked rigidly in place, as if my flesh had been instantaneously turned to solid stone. The grip on my shoulder was not painful. It wasn't aggressively forceful, yet there was an unmistakable crushing solidity to it. It radiated a quiet, absolute assurance that any physical resistance I offered would accomplish absolutely nothing. Slowly, reluctantly, trembling violently from head to toe, I straightened my spine and turned around. Kaelen stood directly behind me. The torrential rain slid effortlessly off his dark, heavy riding cloak. His flawless, aristocratic face was completely calm, his expression as serene as though we had just serendipitously bumped into each other during a casual afternoon stroll through the royal gardens, rather than deep in a muddy forest during a desperate life-or-death flight. For several agonizing seconds, I could not force my vocal cords to work. My shattered mind struggled violently to reconcile the statistical impossibility of his presence here with the undeniable, horrifying physical reality of him standing before me. How did you? My voice broke immediately, sounding raw and pathetic from the freezing air and the sheer overwhelming panic. I followed you, he replied smoothly. The brutal simplicity of the answer made it infinitely worse. You couldn't have. I screamed over the rain, stepping back so his hand fell from my shoulder. I left quietly. The guards were inside. No one saw me. I saw you. Of course he had. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't just followed me. He had likely watched me plan it. He had watched me slip out the gate. He had tracked me through the storm like a predator, letting its prey exhaust itself before the final strike. A hollow, broken sound escaped my throat. It was something horrible between a bitter laugh and a desperate sob. Do you ever stop watching me? Ever? Kaelen's crimson gaze softened slightly, a microscopic shift in his jad mask, but he did not look away from my face for a second. No. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my skin and dripped relentlessly down my neck. It had soaked through my layers of clothing until I was shivering violently, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. He noticed, of course. He noticed every single microscopic detail about me. You will become ill in this weather, he stated matter-of-factly. Without a moment's hesitation, he unclasped his heavy, dry, fur-lined cloak and draped it carefully over my violently trembling shoulders. Despite my weak, pathetic attempt to shrug the garment off in defiance, the cloak was incredibly warm. It trapped his body heat immediately, enveloping me in the overpowering, intoxicating scent of cedar. It felt like being swallowed by him. I don't want your help, I muttered bitterly, though I did not try to push the heavy cloak away a second time. My body was too cold, too desperate for the warmth. I know then why, I shouted. Because you need it. There was absolutely no arrogance or condescension in his tone. There was only quiet, absolute certainty, as if my personal preferences and my hatred mattered significantly less than my biological survival. A sudden, hot surge of anger cut through my paralyzing fear, granting me enough adrenaline for the words to violently spill out of my mouth. I ran away because you kidnapped me, I yelled, turning to face him fully, my chest heaving. Because you refused to let me leave the capital. Because you act as if my entire life, my body, my choices, belong exclusively to you. The rain streamed down Kaelen's flawless face, darkening his raven hair and slightly softening the razor-sharp, aristocratic lines of his features. For a fleeting moment, standing in the storm, he looked slightly younger, almost human, almost vulnerable. But the terrifying, obsessive intensity burning in his crimson eyes remained completely unchanged. And if I let you go, Julian? He asked quietly, his voice cutting clearly through the roar of the storm. Would you ever come back to me? The question completely caught me off guard. No, I answered instantly. The honesty came out far too quickly for my brain to censor it. Something in Kaelen's expression violently tightened. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was a deep, violently controlled spike of pain that vanished behind his mask, before I could be entirely certain I had even seen it. Then you understand precisely why I cannot release you. That doesn't make what you're doing right, I cried out. Right and wrong are abstract luxuries reserved for people with equal power, Julian. It was a bitter, horrific truth, spoken without an ounce of pride. It was simply the brutal reality of the world we lived in. I took another shaky step backward, my boots slipping in the mud. I was testing the physical distance between us, frantically wondering if I had the stamina to turn and run again. Kaelen did not move a single muscle to block my path, yet the dark, towering forest behind him suddenly felt entirely impenetrable. It felt as if the very trees of the world had closed ranks at his command, trapping me in this small clearing with him. I grasped desperately for a weapon, any weapon to hurt him, to make him let me go. "You don't even love me," I spat suddenly, the words tasting like venom. "In the capital, everyone knows you're destined for Elian. You don't even know me well enough for this to be love." He regarded me for a very long, heavy moment before answering. The thunder cracked overhead. "I know enough," Kaelen said softly. "And if you prefer to call this an obsession rather than love, I will not argue the semantics with you." The complete lack of denial, the calm acceptance of his own madness, unsettled me far more deeply than any violent outburst of anger would have. "But why me?" I demanded, my voice breaking completely. Tears of utter frustration finally mixed with the rain on my cheeks. Out of everyone in the entire empire, out of all the beautiful Omegas and brilliant nobles, why fixate on someone who clearly wants absolutely nothing to do with you? For the absolute first time since I had known him, the Crown Prince actually hesitated. The freezing rain filled the heavy silence between us. It was a steady, rhythmic hiss that seemed to muffle the rest of the entire world, shrinking reality down to just the two of us standing in the mud. When Kaelen finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its perfect imperial composure. It sounded slightly ragged. "Because you were the only person in this entire world who never wanted a single thing from me." I blinked, completely thrown by the utterly unexpected answer. "Everyone else in the capital," he continued, taking a slow step toward me, "seeks my favor. They seek my political protection. They seek financial advantage. They seek an affection they can proudly display like a trophy for social status. Even Elian sought the safety of my title." He took another step. "But you withdrew, Julian. You actively avoided my attention, even when receiving it would have greatly benefited your family's standing. You looked at me across that banquet hall as if I were something incredibly dangerous, rather than something desirable." He stopped just inches short of touching me. I could feel the intense heat radiating from his massive body. No one in my entire life had ever looked at me like that before. Understanding finally crept into my mind. It was unwelcome, heavy, and deeply tragic. To a man raised from birth in a cutthroat, artificial world where admiration was a constant, transactional currency, genuine indifference could feel like a divine revelation. Real, unfiltered fear could be easily mistaken for profound honesty, and distance could become utterly, dangerously irresistible, simply because it was the one thing he had never been denied. "You could have just ignored me," I said, weakly, the fight rapidly draining from my freezing body. "I tried," Kaelen said, a faint, entirely humorless smile touching his lips. "It did not work." Thunder rolled low and ominously across the hills, vibrating intensely through the muddy ground beneath our boots. The violent storm showed absolutely no sign of ending, and the freezing cold had begun to seep deeply into my bones, past the heavy wool of his cloak. My teeth were chattering so violently my jaw ached. "I'm tired," I admitted, my voice dropping to a broken, barely audible whisper. "I don't want to fight you anymore." Something dramatic changed in his expression. The crushing, predatory tension eased from his broad shoulders in a way that made my own chest ache in a confusing, entirely unexpected way. "Then don't," he said softly. He slowly extended his large gloved hand toward me, palm facing up. He wasn't violently grasping my wrist this time. He wasn't barking a royal command. He was simply offering it. "Come back inside with me, Julian." I stared down at his outstretched hand for a very long time. The rain battered against his leather glove. I knew the reality of the choice. Accepting his hand would mean completely, finally surrendering the absolute last illusion of control and autonomy I possessed in this life. It meant yielding to the monster of the narrative, but refusing would mean standing entirely alone in a freezing storm with absolutely nowhere else in the world to go, and dying of exposure while he watched. In the bitter end, the monumental decision did not feel dramatic. It didn't feel brave or noble like in the novels. It felt incredibly small, thoroughly exhausted, and painfully human. My pale, freezing fingers trembled violently as I slowly raised my arm and placed my hand into his. Kaelen immediately closed his large fingers around mine. His grip was incredibly careful, almost reverent. He held my hand with a startling gentleness, as if he were holding something infinitely fragile that he was terrified might shatter into dust. The long walk back up the muddy hill to the estate passed in total silence. He did not violently pull me along, nor did he try to hurry my exhausted. stumbling steps through the rain. He simply remained firmly beside me, matching my slow pace, occasionally wrapping a strong arm around my waist to steady me when the muddy ground became too treacherous. The physical contact between us was incredibly warm. It was solid. It was grounding in a terrifying way that I aggressively did not want to analyze too closely. By the time the massive iron gates of the estate finally came into view through the gray sheets of rain, my legs felt exactly like blocks of lead, and my frantic thoughts had dulled into a numb, hazy exhaustion. The estate servants rushed forward the moment we cleared the gates, holding large umbrellas and thick, heated blankets. Their sheer, palpable relief at seeing us was poorly concealed, yet absolutely no one questioned where we had been. No one commented on my soaked, ruined clothing or my mud-streaked face. They behaved flawlessly, as though this exact outcome, my failed escape and his inevitable retrieval, had always been the expected script. Inside the manor, overwhelming warmth enveloped us immediately. A servant rushed forward and pressed a cup of scalding, sweet tea into my freezing hands, while others frantically began preparing a hot bath in my quarters. The sheer efficiency of the household was almost frightening to witness. Kaelen did not leave my side. He stood nearby in the chamber while the attendants fussed over me, stripping away the wet cloak. His crimson gaze was incredibly steady. His physical presence was unmistakable. He wasn't being intrusive, and he wasn't hovering aggressively. He was simply there, ensuring, with his absolute authority, that I did not physically vanish into thin air again. Hours later, scrubbed clean of the mud and wrapped tightly in fresh, dry silk robes, I sat exhausted on the edge of the massive bed. The servants finally bowed and withdrew, leaving the bedchamber completely quiet except for the soft, comforting crackle of the burning brazier in the corner. Kaelen had remained in the room. He stood silently by the tall window, his hands clasped behind his back, calmly watching the violent storm finally taper off into a fine, gentle mist. "I'm sorry," I said suddenly into the quiet room, the words surprising even my own ears. Kaelen turned his head slightly, his profile illuminated by the firelight. "For what?" "For trying to run." A long, heavy pause followed. The only sound was the crackle of the wood. "I am not," Kaelen replied at last, turning fully to face me. "If you had not tried to run today, Julian, you would have spent the rest of your life lying awake, wondering whether escape was truly possible. It was pure, unfiltered honesty, completely stripped of any comforting lies. And now?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Now you know it is not." He approached the bed slowly, stopping at a highly respectful distance, giving me space. "I will not chain you to the walls of this estate, Julian," he said softly. "You may walk the grounds freely. You may read any book in the library. You may write to your family. You may pursue whatever hobbies or interests you desire." He paused, his eyes searching my face. "If you truly wish to return to the capital and the court eventually, we can even arrange that." A tiny, foolish spark of hope flickered in my chest before I could forcefully stop it. "Together," he added quietly. The spark instantly died, crushed under the weight of that single word. "You see," Kaelen continued, his voice remaining incredibly gentle but harboring an unyielding spine of steel, "I am entirely willing to compromise on the details of your life. I only ask for one thing in return." "What?" "That you remain permanently within my reach." Within reach, it didn't mean I was free. It didn't mean we were equals. But it didn't mean I was entirely powerless either. I lay down against the soft pillows at last. The sheer, monumental exhaustion of the day was finally dragging my mind down towards the dark abyss of sleep, completely overriding my lingering, primal fear of him. For the first time in 2 years, I did not actively resist the pull of unconsciousness. Fighting had achieved absolutely nothing except physical and emotional agony. As my heavy eyelids drifted closed, I sensed, rather than saw, Kaelen move closer to the bed. The faint silken rustle of his robes was the only indication. "Rest, Julian," he murmured. His voice was so incredibly soft, so tender, it might have been meant as a comfort for his own soul rather than mine. "You are safe." Safe. It was such a deeply ambiguous word. I was undeniably safe from the brutal world outside these walls, perhaps. I was safe from the cutthroat political schemes of the nobles. I was safe from the executioner's blade that had haunted my nightmares. I was safe from the uncertain, violent future of the original novel. But I was not, and would never be, safe from him. Sleep claimed my mind fully for the absolute first time since arriving at the estate, and miraculously, no terrifying nightmares of the throne room followed. There was only a deep, heavy, absolute darkness that felt, strangely, almost peaceful. When I finally blinked my eyes open many hours later, the bedchamber was dim, illuminated only by a single, low-burning oil lamp. The rain outside had stopped entirely, leaving the night air incredibly cool and fresh as it drifted through the partially open window. Kaelen sat in a velvet chair directly beside the bed. He wasn't touching me. He wasn't speaking. He was simply watching my chest rise and fall, his handsome face bearing an expression that held something incredibly close to profound spiritual relief. "You're still here," he said quietly, his voice slightly raspy. It was not a question. I swallowed hard, my throat feeling dry and rough from sleep. Yes, a slow, shuddering breath left his chest. The crushing, permanent tension seemed to drain entirely from his broad shoulders in a way I had never, ever witnessed before. Good. In that quiet, dimly lit moment, staring into the crimson eyes of the man who had derailed my destiny, I finally understood the exact shape of the future awaiting me. It was not going to be a dramatic, violent imprisonment. It wasn't going to be a life of constant, screaming conflict. It was going to be something vastly quieter, something far more insidious. It was a life meticulously, beautifully arranged so that the thought of leaving would always be infinitely harder, infinitely more painful than simply staying. It was a twisted bond built entirely from forced proximity, absolute dependence, and the slow, inevitable erosion of my resistance. And perhaps in time, as the years stretched on, it might even mutate into something resembling comfort. I turned my face slightly toward the soft pillow. I was too deeply tired to argue with fate anymore. I was too emotionally uncertain to protest. For tonight, simply remaining in this bed was easier than fighting a war I had already lost. For tonight, my survival meant quietly accepting the ironclad terms I possessed no power to change. Somewhere in the shadows behind me, Kaelen shifted slightly, settling deeper into the velvet chair as if fully prepared to remain sitting there for the rest of his natural life. Watching, guarding, waiting, and for the absolute first time since this entire twisted nightmare began, as I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of cedar, I did not feel the desperate urge to run. Not because I had forgiven him for what he had done. Not because I had miraculously stopped being afraid of the monster he was, but because a quiet, deeply unsettling thought had finally taken permanent root in my soul. If Kaelen Thorne truly intended to keep me by his side forever, then perhaps learning how to live within his twisted definition of forever was the only way I could finally stop dying.